Realign for Palestine is a project of the Atlantic Council. It was started by Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. He is a Gazan, a Palestinian. He now lives in America. He has an amazing story. And I think also an important message that it's hard to break through. And that's what he's trying to do with me here with the Atlantic Council, with TED Talks or TED-ish Talks. Welcome to The Gist.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. So I don't know if we're going to air this on Friday, but that's okay.
Well, thanks for having me anyway.
Tell my audience, because I know some of this, about your life story as a Gazan and how this war is having, even at this moment, a horrifying impact on you and your family.
Well, I left the Gaza Strip as a 15-year-old teenager to be an exchange student in the United States for a year-long program. It was a post 9/11 initiative to build cultural bridges between our two countries or our two regions of the world. Upon completing that high school exchange program, I attempted to return to Gaza in the summer of 2006. Hamas had already taken over the coastal enclave following the 2006 parliamentary and municipal elections, and that took place in both Gaza and in the West Bank, as well as the mini brewing civil war, if you will, between itself and the Palestinian Authority. And then there was Hamas carried out an abduction of Gilad Shalit, a young Israeli soldier, on the Israeli side of the Gaza border, and that resulted in a mini war that got the borders closed between Gaza and Egypt, which is where I was. That's how Palestinians in Gaza, in the majority of cases, travel in and out of the Strip. You have to cross a land crossing there. And so after months of being stuck in Egypt, I was able to return to the United States thanks to the support of human rights and peace activists who allowed me to the opportunity to pursue my last year of high school and begin the process of political asylum due to generalized and in specific threats against my life. I interviewed for asylum, ironically, on June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas violently and finally took over the entirety of the Gaza Strip.
Right. They slaughtered their enemies. They had won I don't even think the majority in the parliamentary elections, right? Precisely. They had won a plurality, but they pressed their power. They pretty much killed their enemies, Fatah not being that important or functional a force for a while. And then they consolidated power. And then soon thereafter, Israel pulled out whatever vestiges. And there were some significant ones, right? You talk about an airport, greenhouses, etc. Israel totally pulls out and walls off Gaza. Am I getting that about right?
So that happened in 2005. We're actually coming up on the 20th anniversary. That happened prior to the election. So I left 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements in 2005. It was supposed to be a new era that could have ushered in some hope for the people of the coastal enclave. Gaza had a short. I experienced I was going to share this in a second, but I experienced the tail end of the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, whereby there was hope. We had Oslo, to me and my family, meant we had Palestinian passports instead of having Egyptian travel documents. We had ID cards. We had a short-lived airport that our family flew into in 1999 and in the year 2000. We had hope for a rejuvenated economy. My uncles were both working in Israel, but there was an industrial zone in northern Gaza, right on the border with Israel, and cooperation with Israelis. And then there was the second intifada that happened in the year 2000, right after the failed Camp David peace talks, in which the Palestinians and the Israelis failed to reach an agreement. And so I share that because I experienced the yin and the yang, if you will, the optimism and the hope and the challenges of being in Gaza during the second intifada. But I also share that in the spirit that Gaza, like anywhere in the world, is a complex place that meant so much to its people. There are beautiful memories that I have in that place, even during the challenging times of the family members, of the lived experiences. There was the food, there was the flying the kites. I was a masterful kite builder. Gaza actually holds the world record in the number of simultaneous kites flown, which is around 7,800 in 2008, I believe is the number.
I guess one of the most heavily populated, densely populated places in the world, you'd also have dense kite populations.
There's that as well. And so there's that reality, but then there's also, of course, the political instability and the violence, which was not just something that you experience in the context of the military occupation back then, or the Second Intifada, which was Palestinians and Israelis, but there was an internal dimension to the violence, internal instability, internalized violence between the different factions, with all the internalized trauma, some of which was generational, some of which was new. So there are a lot of complex dynamics that really defy the black and white depictions of the Gaza Strip on both sides by either the pro-Palestine folks or the pro-Israel community that are just a lot more difficult to capture.
For instance, if you went back to Gaza, let's not say now, that's somewhat ridiculous, and we could get into what a peace or a post-war period might look like. Would you, and you've been detained and denied admission into Israel, but would you have significant fears for your life because you're here advocating for a two-state solution?
Well, I would have concerns, less so because of my advocacy for the two-state solution, and more because I have kind of been extraordinarily and ruthlessly against the armed resistance narrative and Hamas and October 7th as something that has been entirely unhelpful to the just and urgent aspirations of the Palestinian people. I have been what some would label a contrarian when it comes to the pro-Palestine narrative, and I've actually been very critical of a lot of both Gaza-based actions by Hamas and others, as well as diaspora-based forms of activism and advocacy. So my concerns would be that I have called Hamas a legitimate terrorist organization, not organic, a representation of organic resistance to occupation.
The word legitimate there in that phrase means bona fide, true, yes.
Precisely. Yes. And that the word Hamas, and I remember this very vividly. I remember the linguistic manipulation of the language, the word muqawama, the word resistance, and how Hamas never referred to themselves as Hamas, but they usurped the word resistance, which to the Palestinian people meant it was a spectrum, it was a rainbow. It meant a lot of different things. It meant persevering on what remains of our land. It meant maintaining our olive trees. My grandmother, my grandparents who were, expelled in 1948, they had these trees, these fig trees, these guava trees, these olive trees that were literally over 50 years old and 60 years old in the Gaza Strip. And this war, this since October 7th, this disaster has uprooted all of that. Qualitatively and quantitatively, what has befallen the Palestinian people since October 7th is actually an order of magnitude worse than what happened in 1948. So to me, I call that out just as much as I am very critical of the far right within Israel. And I actually, to me, and I'll conclude with just saying this: when you are the weaker party in a conflict, in a situation like what we have in Israel and Palestine, and certainly like what we have in Gaza, the onus is on you to be careful and effective, because you know that you have the most far-right government in Israel's history that is eager to basically use any of your mistakes to undermine your national project. So that's where I hold Hamas ultimately responsible for the death and destruction that has befallen my family and my people.
And on the idea of words and the usurpation of the resistance movement, maybe people don't know this. Hamas is an acronym, like NATO's an acronym, and the M is, what is it? You say it in Arabic.
Muqawama.
And that means resistance. So they became resistance. It was good branding. They are excellent at communicating, and they're pretty ruthless too. And when you control all means of communication, maybe it's easier to get your message across. So that is a very interesting point. And just to bring it up to more recent events and tragedies, you've had over 30 members of your family, including very close uncle, killed in this war.
Yes, my 12-year-old niece, Farah, who is survived by her twin sister, Marah, who didn't know for 3 days that her sister had lost her life. My uncle Riyadh, my dad's youngest brother, whom I grew up with and who worked in Israel, who spoke perfect Hebrew. We lived in a family building made up of 4 floors that had over 35 people at its peak living in it. On my mom's side of the family, we lost in the building that was struck on December 14th, 2023. We lost all of my aunts and uncles on my mom's side, Aunt Zainab, Uncle Abdullah, Aunt Hind, Uncle Hassan, my cousins Yahya, my cousins Osama, and over 14 children who were under the age of 9. Babies 3 and 4 months old, shredded to bits and pieces. Folks who were over in their 60s and 70s, and that unfortunately, they, like thousands, tens of thousands of Palestinians, are paying the ultimate price for a sin that they did not commit and a war that they did not start and are helpless and powerless to stop.
How do you apportion blame for those deaths?
Well, at the end of the day, the Israeli military dropped those bombs, plain and simple. However, what I have so that, like, those were Israeli bombs dropped by Israeli airplanes. And I have said as much publicly, and I have said that I, repeatedly have asked the IDF and the second case in particular, in which 29 folks were killed. There was the New York Times did a mini investigation, the Amnesty International did an investigation, Foreign Policy did a profile on me and asked the IDF. And so these cases received high profile attention, and we reached out to the IDF and with coordinates, with times, with locations, and never really got any answers. However, I absolutely am of the belief that had Hamas simply kept its soldiers at home on October 7th, my family, like tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians, would still be alive. 2 million Palestinians in Gaza would still be in their home. Hamas served our people, my family included, on a silver platter to the most far-right government in Israel's history. And now Hamas is acting as if it has no ability, no influence, no capability to stop the war. And so in effect, I have no control over the Israeli government and their actions and what they do. But what I do have control over is to speak out against the very party that claims to represent the Palestinian people, to hold their interests at heart, to have governed them with an iron fist for almost 2 decades. The very party that has tortured Gazans over the years, including right now, is executing anybody who protested or against it or speaks out against its rule. And so that, to me, is part of why I can't speak to the Israeli government without blaming the very terror ISIS-like organization that Islamized Palestinian society, that usurped our ability to have democratic governance, that ruined the very worthwhile and urgent and just aspirations of the Palestinian people for freedom, dignity, independence, self-determination, statehood, liberation, and destroyed that. And now our people are vulnerable to displacement, to forced displacement under the guise of voluntary migration. And so that's why I'm very vehemently against the Islamist terror group.
Do you think serving up your family on a silver platter was an act of horribly callous indifference, or do you think it's more of a tactical act that fits in with Hamas's specific aims?
Well, I think the two things can be true at once. On the one hand, I mean, I genuinely believe that Hamas are fools and are not very well known for strategic foresight and I mean some people really like to assign brilliance to Hamas, and I think they've stumbled into success on October 7th with a
Yeah.
very negligent, with a very underprepared, with a with underprepared Israeli military high command, a busy Israel that had internal dissent around Netanyahu and the judicial overhaul and the protests and the moving of a lot of divisions out of Gaza into the West Bank. I genuinely believe that Hamas stumbled into this success due to negligence and a failure of imagination. However, I also think that Hamas very deliberately, as Sinwar has stated during the war and multiple verified intercepts confirmed, and Ismail Haniyeh, who was also assassinated, said, like, these are consistent statements that tell you this is part of the literature, part of the group's ethos, part of the group's vision, is they look at the death of my family and all the children and all the tens of thousands of Gazans as, quote, necessary sacrifices that are going to gin up, all this empathy and sympathy for the Palestinian cause. They genuinely thought that college protesters, massive demonstrations in Western capitals, that the outrage over the death and destruction in the Gaza Strip is somehow going to single-handedly stop the war and save their rule.
Yeah.
And when
but they also thought that Hezbollah and other like-minded militias would join in with their cause right afterwards, and that didn't happen. They thought a lot of things.
Precisely. Yeah. But I can't. The unfortunate, sad reality is when I share that, when I speak about that, so many people attack me and vilify me and say, you're just repeating Israeli propaganda. I mean, but it is absolutely a fact that Hamas relies on the maiming and killing of Palestinians to undermine and delegitimize the Israeli war effort. And like as evidenced by those statements and as evidenced by the fact that the group they're hiding among the civilians, they're hiding in their tunnels. They have left our people defenseless.
I don't think they've invited many civilians in the tunnels, which is what they spent the vast majority of funds on.
Precisely. Yeah. And so to me, this is what's so heartbreaking, is that there has been a failure to both hold space for multiple things at once. Yes, speak out against the atrocities and the potential and I think the real war crimes that are taking place in Gaza at the hands of the IDF and some of the the clear and indefensible acts that are so visibly just inconsistent with the IDF's own stated policy of mitigating risk to uninvolved civilians and innocent civilians.
Right.
Do that while also having immense contempt for the very terror ISIS-like organization that started this war.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, which is, tell me if I'm getting it right, that everything you laid out, Haniyeh, Sinwar, they knew this would happen. They wanted this to happen. But it is also the case that Israel can go too far. They probably knew that Israel would go, quote unquote, too far. Do you think it's possible that Israel has committed war crimes in this war?
Well, I will also share that I have had a chance I've connected with hostage families. I've connected with survivors of October 7th. I've connected with Israelis at the think tank levels, at the diplomatic levels. I have been, and that's for two dual tracks. There's a kind of a healing, reconciliation, mutual empathy and humanity component to where I am personally choosing to build bridges and to honor the legacy of my family members, to to break out of the vicious cycle of hatred, incitement, violence, revenge, rinse and repeat. And that is a central component of Realign for Palestine, is a rejection of violence and an acknowledgement of the legitimacy of both people's existence, rights to safety and security. And that is not kumbaya. That is a foundational core principle that, again, not just guides Realign for Palestine, but I think is going to be a necessary framework for guiding us past the cacophony of hatred, division, incitement, and all the incendiary and insidious rhetoric. On the other hand, there is a policy component to what I'm trying to do at the Atlantic Council with Realign for Palestine that entails understanding, like genuinely understanding beyond sloganeering, beyond surface level anti-Israel rhetoric. How does Israel function? How does the IDF function? What are, like I have a degree in intelligence and national security. What is the military side and science here in the United States? Mm-hmm. How does Israel think about this from a military strategy? How does that interact with the political side? How does the United States plug into this? Like, I want to understand the big picture, because if we are to be forward thinking about Gaza's future and about a resolution of the conflict, we have to actually begin by just understanding how this works.
Go ahead.
There absolutely was an unbelievable shock that happened on October 7th. I mean, this was their 9/11. This was the worst single day attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. There was just an immense sense of, on the political side, embarrassment and failure. And the military side, there was a belief, and I actually know this from as a Gazan with a lot of context on the ground. I'm not just some dude who left Gaza and is like, okay, my family are there, my family members, my father, my brothers were involved in NGOs and UNRWA and the UN. The IDF was involved in some strategies that it thought were releasing some of the pressure in Gaza, like allowing 20,000 day laborers to go into Israel. And that number was about to become 50,000, like allowing different, like Turkish, Saudi, Jordanian, Egyptian, Emirati, all Malaysian, Indonesian products were coming into Gaza.
Right. There was some amount of student visas going on.
Yeah, there was some. So the IDF was like, okay, we want to release the pressure so that we manage this, because they were tasked with carrying out what the regime of the blockade and the restrictions. And the blockade was not this static system. It changed over the 18 years. Sometimes it was very restrictive. Sometimes, and I would argue, it was actually the loosest right up to October 6th. They felt, and I've talked to some of them, I've read some of this stuff, I've had interactions with people who were in those discussions. They felt an immense sense of betrayal in what they were like, what they felt. This is from their perspective. I'm not saying I endorse or don't endorse. A sense of betrayal that here we were trying to do the best we can with the political orders that we were given by the Netanyahu government to facilitate some relief in Gaza and to make this blockade basically as invisible as possible to the average citizen in Gaza. Now, Gazans would dispute that. I get that. And then what did we get in return? We got like a tiny little Holocaust-like attack. So at every level, and then finally, there was the fact, and I can attest to this, having known some of the folks in the kibbutzim, in the communities that were attacked. It is a fact. This is not a talking point. It is a fact that some of these folks who were killed and burned alive and slaughtered and butchered were absolutely peaceniks who viewed the Palestinians.
That was the demographic of the kind of person who would found those kibbutzim. Yeah.
And my father, who passed away 5 years ago, in 3 days it'll be exactly 5 years ago. He was like folks in some of those kibbutzim would actually for free help him access treatment inside of Israel. Like that is something that this is not just a Haaretz story. This is something that I personally have experienced. And so the totality of the aforementioned just created unimaginable rage that at every level, whether it was the political level, the high command level, the mid command level, or the infantry and the foot soldiers, many of whom were reservists and were, Israel is one big village. Why am I saying all of this? I'm not, again, in the business of justifying Israel's actions. I'm simply saying that as someone who lost family members, I took it upon myself to really, truly get into the minds of Israelis and understand what motivated them. How did they receive October 7th? And unfortunately, what happened was the initial phase of the war was one characterized by immense rage, where a lot of the safety guards were rolled back. Then, as pressure mounted on the Israeli military by the United States and by other international players to try and minimize or reduce civilian the damage to civilians and harm to civilians, some of those orders that were given at the higher command level, by the time they percolated to mid-level commanders and field officers and foot soldiers, there was a disconnect between, like, those orders were supposedly not truly being implemented and followed. And there was a breakdown of discipline. So we saw those terrible videos of all the cell phone footage of soldiers. Sometimes they would abuse some Palestinian prisoners. Sometimes there were those infamous wearing of women's lingerie, etc. And so that was a long answer to say, yes, absolutely, I think there were atrocities and war crimes committed for which I hope there's accountability, in the same way that I hope there's absolutely accountability for Hamas and the terrorists in Gaza, not just for what they did on October 7th. No. This is a missing piece that no one talks about. And I insist on making this front and center. I want accountability for Hamas and PIJ and other terrorists for using civilian infrastructure to carry. And that is well documented and well understood, whereby, in effect, they are using civilians as human shields. Stealing humanitarian aid, again, well documented. Torturing and abusing Palestinians in Gaza, suspected of being collaborators, and carrying out summary executions. Killing and torturing Palestinians who tried to protest in recent weeks. And those are people, some of them I know personally, and I've been talking to personally on the ground and been supporting them, who are saying, we want an end to the war. We want an end to Hamas, and Hamas has been brutally repressing them and killing them left and right. I want Hamas to be held accountable for that as well. Crimes against Palestinians, as well as crimes on October 7th.
Well, the ICC has issued arrest warrants for Hamas leaders, probably dead Hamas leaders, but also Netanyahu and Gallant. What do you think of them? Of those, the fact of these arrest warrants, are they warranted? Do they help or hurt things?
When that happened, I supported, and I still largely in principle support, the concept of targeted judicial legal accountability. On the other hand, I felt going after Sinwar and Deif, and I felt that there was a token effort to go after some Palestinian leadership
who are dead, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And that basically lets Hamas off the hook. That I didn't like. Also, there are potential questions of jurisdiction that cast doubt on the efficacy of this strategy of lawfare. The same is true with the ICJ, whereby, it was ruled that there is maybe a risk of genocide, but to the average uneducated folks who are not really trained in international law, this was taken as, oh, the ICJ said there is genocide in Gaza.
Well, I would say for many months before the Chief Justice went on a BBC show, it was reported in every news outlet that the ICJ had essentially indicted Israel for genocide. And she made clear what you just said. And this was not at all, even in Israel, even in Haaretz, as you mentioned, this wasn't emphasized what the actual ruling was.
And if I may share with you, I think, like, even on the issue of like, again, I do want for there to be nonviolent, political, diplomatic, legal means for the pursuit of accountability, especially because I am an advocate for nonviolence. I mean, and at the end of the day, it's like, I understand that you have to give the Palestinians some options. On the other hand, I feel like this genocide issue has become a conversation ender. I genuinely believe that while there have been immense, horrendous acts happening in this war, do I believe there are people in Israel who want to commit genocide? Absolutely. You bet.
Many of them are quoted in that ICJ document. People who maybe have positions in government, maybe people who are on the news. I agree with that too.
Do I believe there could potentially be a scenario where some specific acts could potentially, eventually rise to the level of genocide? Maybe. But do I believe it is the formal, official textbook policy of the state of Israel to carry out a genocide in Israel? No, I do not. But guess what? 50,000 plus Palestinians, and I think the number is a lot more, are still dead, including family members. What difference does it make? I feel that this conversation, this has become an obsession. This has become a complete conversation ender to attempt to adjudicate the issue of genocide without actually talking about the difficult substantive issues and nuanced conversation. The other thing that I have been speaking to several really high-level folks, both in Israel and in the United States, who have warned me of the following. They said that folks who do not believe what is happening is a genocide. They've warned me that 10 years from now, 10 years from now, we could have a scenario in which Smotrich or Ben-Gvir are defense ministers, in which case they would remove a lot of even what little safeguards might be in place by then to protect Palestinian civilians. And because that's their whole shtick is they want to push out the Palestinians, they want to starve them, they want to get rid of them. They actually would want to carry out genocide. These are people that are immensely, or others, in other characters. What are we going to do then? Mm-hmm. People have basically used it would be like the equivalent of crying wolf. Are you going to call it genocide plus, genocide super, genocide on steroids? Like, my point is that words matter, slogans matter. There are tiers of horrors that happen in war. You cannot call every horrendous, awful, terrible thing that happens in war genocide. Otherwise, Yemen is a genocide, Fallujah is a genocide, Mosul is a genocide, Syria is a genocide, every war becomes a genocide, Libya is a genocide, and that's just not helpful to the Palestinian people. I look at this from the lens of what is helpful for the Palestinian people, from spreading awareness of what is happening and reaching otherwise unreachable audiences, and not blocking conversations or otherwise legitimate pathways for legal justice.
Is your primary audience the kind of person who might be a Palestinian or is aligned and very aggrieved by the Palestinian cause, but uses rhetoric that is often incendiary, or adheres to or espouses some sort of principles that will never get us closer to a peace? Is that your main audience, who obviously you're talking to anyone who will listen, but is that who you're really mostly trying to convince?
Well, it's a really interesting question that is constantly evolving for a couple of reasons. My in an ideal world, and this is part of what I'm trying to do with Realign for Palestine and the team and the
Yeah, that's the question.
Palestinian
Who are you asking
voices.
to realign is essentially the question.
Well, so in an ideal world, I want the Palestinian American, Palestinian diaspora, Muslims and Arabs to be the target audience of this message. And the interesting dynamic at play here is that I have a lot of folks who are watching, who are listening. Many are often privately messaging me and reaching out and saying, "Thank God you're saying what we know is true." But we struggle saying in public, or we struggle articulating in public because of the difficult dynamics in our community. Or if someone, if I had a penny for every time someone said, "Thank God someone else is saying it and that it doesn't have to be me." The challenge is, as is the case with a lot of communities around a lot of social and political issues, but especially so with the Israel and Palestine issue, within the Palestinian, Arab, and or Muslim communities. And those are three separate communities. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're stacked, and sometimes they're entirely separate. I can have like 90% agreement with someone on a variety of issues, or 80%, or 95%, or 85%. But this little margin of disagreement around Hamas, around Israel's right to exist and to live in safety and security, around the need to renounce violence, the need to hold space for multiple truths, the need for radical pragmatism. They may disagree with some of these points, or the fact that I personally believe a lot of these encampments and a lot of these forms of unhelpful college activism have become really toxic to the discourse. And then all of that 90% agreement is thrown to the trash. And then I become a Zionist, spy, Mossad, traitor, treacherous, sellout, elders of Zion tool, spy master, every insult. I become fat, I become bald, I become ugly, I become this. So like they'll go for anything. They'll go, and if they can't, and if I keep responding rationally and calmly, they'll just be like, "Well, your glasses look ugly, and I just don't like the way you look." Or someone just said recently to me, like, "You look like a devil worshiper."
Okay.
So unfortunately, that is the state of play within the highly emotionally charged community in the diaspora. And so what then ends up happening is a lot of the folks that do engage with and listen to the message are often not of Palestinian or Arab or Muslim background, generally speaking, but especially there's an immense interest in what I have to say within different facets of the Jewish/Israeli communities across both of whom are not monolithic. Jews are not monolithic. Zionists are not monolithic. Israelis are not monolithic. I have folks from the right, from the center right, from the left. I have anti-Zionists. I have liberal Zionists who listen to me. Folks who are desperate for just a sense of acknowledgement. They want to live in peace with Palestinians. They want to feel like it's possible to have a real shot at coexistence. Folks who tell me in the thousands from the other side, from the Israeli or pro-Israel side, that I'm with no, in their own words, I single-handedly helped revive their optimism that maybe peace is possible, or I helped them see Gazans as human beings, or I helped them realize that not everyone in Gaza is Hamas. Now, obviously, that should go without saying. I mean, statistically, it's ridiculous to say everybody. There's Fatah, there's like seculars, there's like, but I've had time and again, I've had even Israeli soldiers reach out to me and be like, screw Hamas, I want to all the way, I'm blah, 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 but you help me realize that there really are innocent people in the Gaza Strip. And it's like, think of, like, I don't know, like, think of what that may or may not do to this soldier, and how they can carry themselves or conduct themselves in Gaza. And so the funny thing is, I was just at a graduate college campus, and I was attacked by these students afterwards. Some of them. It was a very prominent, very, very prominent school. And this person came up to me afterwards and was like, we don't want you to humanize the people of Gaza, because your whole strategy for humanizing them is to say they're not Hamas. Well, what if they are Hamas? They should be proud to all be Hamas. And I was like, okay, like, whoa, okay, where is this coming from? And then I was like trying to rationally engage. And it was like, well, I basically, long story short, they said that this particular person said they love Hamas, screw the hostages, October 7th was wonderful, and Israel has no business existing in Palestine, and boom, 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 boom. And I had spent an hour and a half in that talk trying to construct the most rational pro-Palestine argument from a self-interested point of view to say peace, being against violence, rejecting Hamas, turning to nation building, using Gaza as a role model for what an occupation-free West Bank can and should look like, to make a compelling example for Israel, for the US, for the world, to say we're not aid-dependent subjects. We are capable of effective self-governance. Like, I used up half of my brain cells to construct such a scientific case, and literally this was this graduate public policy student response to what I had to say.
Yeah.
But so unfortunately, when emotions are the guiding principle for a lot of people, what's left?
Ivy League school?
Not quite.
Okay.
But very, very, very prominent
Gotcha.
school.
Yeah. I noticed I have two more questions. One is this. I noticed a couple times in the interview you likened Hamas to ISIS, and it's an apt comparison in that they're both particularly vicious in the world of the vicious, and they used brutality to achieve surprising battlefield gains. So it's a good analogy. But is part of the reason that you're saying that because, A, even in America, you still do not get the cheering on of ISIS. ISIS has a toxic brand in the West in the way that Hamas apparently doesn't. But also that B, ISIS was opposed by the vast majority of the Muslim world and the Arab world. And if we're successful in really tying those two as being very similar, maybe there's some hope for the Arab world to turn against the goals of Hamas and the tactics of Hamas.
Well, that's I love your attention to detail. I will tell you that from the beginning, I have very, very specifically struggled with this issue. On the one hand, early on, the cerebral kind of analytic brain, the cerebral analytic part of my brain was worried that to claim Hamas is ISIS was going to have grave policy implications and a misunderstanding of how Hamas operates, and how to misunderstand how Hamas has a nationalistic component to it. And that it's better to view them as an extremist Muslim Brotherhood organization that has a very specific context that is not really relevant or helped. It's not that is not better understood by connecting it to ISIS. On the other hand, from 10 years ago, and speaking with folks in Gaza, People in Gaza, I mean, it has been well established. Hamas is very much so a mini ISIS. And in Arabic, the friends that I would speak to, they would use like almost like a little words that like local words that describe little children. They're little zantut. They're like little tiny little ISIS, like just little piggy, kind of like little ISIS. And they draw from the same like core ideology of Sayyid Qutb and Hassan al-Banna that gave rise to the Muslim Brotherhood, that gave rise to Al-Qaeda, that gave rise to the jihadi ideology that sought to transcend national borders. And as time went on, I mean, Hamas uses jihadi ideology. Hamas has always been jihadi. Hamas's ruthlessness has always been very, very aligned with ISIS. As time went on, and I saw what has become a severe degradation in the pro-Palestine discourse, in which support for Hamas has become very mainstream, very, very mainstream. And I do not say this as a form of hyperbole. Just as I'm not suggesting that all pro-Palestine folks are pro-Hamas. That is not the case. But I challenge anybody who is anti-Hamas but is pro-Palestine to go in a big pro-Palestine space and speak out against Hamas. Mm-hmm. And tell me what happens to you. I'm right here. I will platform you. I will pay for your medical care. I will do anything you need. Because unfortunately, support for Hamas is now mainstream, and I would argue the majority of a lot of the discourse. Not insofar as to say I love Hamas per se, but to immediately deflect to, well, what about Israel? They have a right to resist, international law, etc. So by now calling them Hamas, like I have been gradually linking them to ISIS, because they absolutely are from an ideology and a strategy point of view. And we're coming up on 2 years into this. I am hoping that this begins to create that point of reference and comparison. But I at this point, I don't feel that there is the concern for the policy misjudgment, because it's very clear that Hamas has got to go, even though we know they're not going to fully disappear as an ideology, but that's irrelevant at this point. What Hamas has been doing in Gaza is very ISIS-like, and it's time we stop dancing around the topic. It's time we shake some sense into the pro-Palestine community and say, you are literally destroying the long-lasting Palestinian cause by tying it to an ISIS, a mini Palestinian ISIS.
My last question is it possible for a 10-year-old Gazan to turn into Ahmed? Because I think about the elements of your biography and just talking to you, and this isn't only the fault of Hamas or Israel. You left Gaza because there was a U.S.-sponsored program after 9/11 to try to make some inroads into the Muslim/Arab world. You got asylum here in the United States. You were exposed to, from your father and, I don't know, all of your media consumption, but different arguments, different ethical orientations. So that is my question. Is it hopeless for the next Ahmad to exist?
Oh, completely the opposite, brother. Completely the opposite. And I am not like selling you a bridge or a bill of goods. There are thousands of Ahmeds out there that may not speak English as well, that they may not be as outspoken. And it is my goal with Realign for Palestine. It is my intention, my desire, my aspiration to equip folks with the courage, the vision, the idea, the desire to be a part of something much better for their own future, much different than the waste of lives and resources in a vicious cycle of jihadi terrorism that leads nowhere, that gets us killed, gets more of our lands taken over or squandered with nothing to show for it. On the other hand, I think unfortunately, like there's been an overstating in the idea of like people are a product of their environment. And if they've been living under Hamas for 18 years, yes, there will be some adjustment, especially after this war, some period of adjustment in which folks emerge out of that. However, public opinion, public attitude is elastic. It is not rigid. It changes. People go through transformation. People go through different stages in life that enable them to really have journeys, have moments of transformation. I have helped young men and women in Gaza learn English, get out of Gaza during the war, access scholarships, access just talk to them about what do you need to minimize the chances of you being denied a student visa in the United States, or you being denied exit out of Gaza through the Ramon airport. So I am full of hope and optimism. I would not be throwing myself into the ring and putting myself out there if I felt that this was truly and entirely hopeless.
Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib runs the Realign for Palestine project with the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.